Alain Locke, Ambivalence and Hope. On March 21st, 1924, Paul Kellog, editor of Survey Graphic, attended the Writers Guild meeting at the Civic Club in New York City. The immediate occasion was to celebrate the publication of Jessie Fauset's novel, There Is Confusion, but the deeper interest was to encourage and give public recognition to the many black writers and poets then beginning to gather in New York. Alain Locke, a professor of philosophy at Howard University in Washington, D.C., but a close friend and intellectual confidant of many of the most creative figures then living in New York, was selected as master of ceremonies and offered some introductory thoughts as to what he felt was then taking place. They sense within their group, meaning the Negro group, a spiritual wealth which, if they can properly expound, will be ample for a new judgment and reappraisal of the race. Other remarks Locke had to make were not recorded, but his contemporary held an important meaning for Kellog, who was then thinking of devoting an entire issue of his magazine to black writers and intellectuals. 2 weeks after the Writers Guild dinner, Locke eagerly responded to Kellogg's intentions by promising to send a proposal as to what such an issue might include. Throughout the year, Locke and Kellogg revised and re-evaluated their original conception, made contacts with various black writers, and criticized and modified the work they began to receive. In January 1925, in a letter to George Peabody, Kellogg explained the vision that he and Locke shared and hoped soon to achieve. Our number is not built around Du Bois or his long-time militant espousals. Neither is it built around Booker T. Washington's or Mr. Moton and their industrial, educational, and rural programs. We may be altogether wrong, but we think we sense a new approach, growing out of northward migrations and the city environment. The silver lining of the injurious circumstances you speak of, the Negro expressing himself not against something, but for something, and so breaking with the Du Bois tradition. It seems to me that the cultural renaissance is in opposition essentially to the rural and vocational and community programs of the Hampton tradition. Near at home, perhaps, it is harder to see it, but I believe it is there, and that it does offer a text by which the needs and aspirations of our Negro fellow citizens can be interpreted in a way which will win a fresh hearing. Such, at least, is our endeavor. Finally, encouraged as well as challenged by an article in the American Mercury, Homo Africanus, the Harlem issue of Survey Graphic was completed and published in March 1925. 8 months later, Locke's more comprehensive and celebrated anthology, The New Negro, built upon the writings and poetry in the Survey Graphic, was published in November 1925. Locke's role as spokesman, as well as intellectual and artistic gadfly, has often been compared to that of Van Wyck Brooks. As S.B. Fullinwider comments, Alain Locke was, by analogy, the Van Wyck Brooks of the Black American. In announcing the New Negro, he was, in effect, proclaiming the Negro's coming of age. However, though Locke shared with Brooks a certain intellectual perspective, such a perspective was based on a very different perception of the American past and a quite different understanding of the American present. In Brooks's call for a cultural renaissance, and in his lament that America did not possess the organic culture and folk spirit that could be seen in Ireland, France, and Russia, he did not once give thought to the folk life of black Americans. This was a striking omission, one that Alain Locke was quick to correct. Locke, of course, was responding only indirectly to Brooks's omission, for such an omission was simply part of a continuing historical neglect he sought to alter, and in an important sense, Locke understood such neglect, as well as the kind of attention that had been given, as central to the challenge he and others now confronted. Brooks sought to escape the past, for he felt that America lacked the cohesion of an intense group or community life. As a consequence, he championed European literature and culture, and saw in the folk cultures of other countries the spiritual vitality he thought so lacking in his own past. For Locke, however, such conclusions were too facile, too hasty, and ultimately circular. Such a point of view only served to perpetuate that which was decried, a past without meaning. The problem for Locke was not that there failed to exist a meaningful past, but that the past had been defined in such a way as to make it meaningless. Thus, in the opening chapter of The New Negro, Locke writes, "The Negro of today must be seen through other than the dusty spectacles of past controversy. In the past, no less than in the present, the spectacles of controversy were more real than the reality that was there to be seen." So, for generations in the mind of America, the Negro has been more a formula than a human being, as something to be argued about, condemned, or defended, to be kept down or in his place or helped up, to be worried with or worried over, harassed or patronized, a social bogey or a social burden. The thinking Negro even has been induced to share the same general attitude, to focus his attention on controversial issues, to see himself in the distorted perspective of a social problem. His shadow, so to speak, has been more real to him than his personality. Little true social or self-understanding has or could come from such a situation. No less than Brooks, Locke sought to establish an individual and social identity, but for him this also meant re-establishing an identity that Brooks and others assumed or defined as non-existent. Recently, Locke has been criticized both for his intellectual and aesthetic convictions, and the form in which these convictions were expressed. Nathan Huggins, for example, argues that both Brooks and Locke built their arguments in ironic and essentially self-defeating terms. There is, however, a problem which promotions such as Van Wyck Brooks, New American, and Alain Locke's New Negro share. It is in the metaphor itself. For whatever promise the new man has for the future, his name and the necessity for his creation imply some inadequacy in the past. Like the New Year's resolution, or the turning over a new leaf, the debut of the new Negro announced a dissatisfaction with the old Negro. And since the new-old dichotomy is a mere convenience of mind, Afro-Americans were really the same people all along. The so-called old Negro was merely carried within the bosom of the new as a kind of self-doubt, perhaps self-hate. How can one take up the promotion of race or nationality through art without exposing this doubt? And this doubt, in turn, was the reflection of a larger doubt that both black and white Americans held toward their own past. For in comparison to the sophisticated culture of Europe, America seemed worthy of little more attention than embarrassment and apology. So provincialism pulled the black intellectual, like his white American brother, away from the culture of his experience into the culture of his learning. There is a certain degree of ambiguity in Locke's use of the term New Negro, but the ambiguity is less in the term than in the assessment Locke made of the American past. Huggins' dismissal of the new-old dichotomy as a mere convenience of mind is very close, ironically, to the argument Locke himself was attempting to make. What was new about the new Negro was essentially a consciousness that all that had been said and believed in the past had little to do with the true humanity and self-worth of black Americans. The old Negro has long become more of a myth than a man. The old Negro, we must remember, was a creature of moral debate and historical controversy. His has been a stock figure perpetuated as an historical fiction, partly in innocent sentimentalism, partly in deliberate reactionism. The Negro himself has contributed his share to this through a sort of protective social mimicry forced upon him by the adverse circumstances of dependence. The task, then, was to rediscover the past, for the inadequacy in that past was not so much in the past itself, but in the minds of those who continued to misread it. Clearly, Locke's task was difficult, for his attempt to discover a usable past was as much a metaphysical as a historical project. The most succinct statement of Locke's philosophical outlook appeared in American Philosophy Today and Tomorrow, 1935, in an essay titled Values and Imperatives. Locke begins his essay by immediately qualifying the objectivity of traditional metaphysical inquiry. All philosophies, it seems to me, are in ultimate derivation philosophies of life, and not of abstract, disembodied, objective reality. products of time, place, and situation, and thus systems of timed history rather than timeless eternity. Locke's emphasis on the relativity of knowledge is most generally a critique of earlier worldviews, wherein both rationalists and empiricists alike assumed an objective world order independent of human consciousness, but available to discovery, understanding, or imitation. Specifically, he is concerned with the subjectivity of the social observer and the degree to which his observations were a projection of his own unique sensitivities and individual personality. At the same time, however, he is quick to qualify the intent of his remarks. No conception of philosophy, however relativistic, however opposed to absolutism, can afford to ignore the question of ultimates or abandon what has been so aptly, though skeptically termed, the quest of certainty. To do that is not merely to abdicate traditional metaphysics with its rationalistic justification of absolutes, but also to stifle embryonic axiology with its promising analysis of norms. Several sections of American thought, however, have been so anxious to repudiate intellectualism and escape the autocracy of categoricals and universals that they have been ready to risk this. Though they have at times discussed the problems of value, they have usually avoided their normative aspects, which has led them into the bloodless behaviorism as arid as the intellectualism they have abandoned, or else resulted in a completely individualistic and anarchic relativism, which has rightly been characterized recently as philosophic nihilism. In dethroning our absolutes, we must take care not to exile our imperatives, for after all, we live by them. We must realize more fully that values create these imperatives, as well as the more formally superimposed absolutes, and that norms control our behavior as well as guide our reasoning. For Locke, man lives in a world of meaning, for experience itself is a qualitative act. As a consequence, Locke stresses the importance of values in human behavior, not simply as moral categories or codes of conduct, but rather as qualities of perception rooted in the existential nature of man himself. We must realize that not in every instance is this normative control affected indirectly through judgmental or evaluational processes, but often through primary mechanisms of feeling modes and dispositional attitudes. Thus, Locke seeks to establish a theoretical basis that would account for and include inner states of feeling as central to the world of human experience. But in so doing, it is also his conviction that a certain objectivity regarding human behavior should be attained. To my thinking, the gravest problem of contemporary philosophy is how to ground some normative principle or criterion or objective validity for values without resort to dogmatism and absolutism on the intellectual plane, and without falling into their corollaries on the plane of social behavior and action, of intolerance and mass coercion. This calls for a functional analysis of value norms and a search for normative principles in the immediate context of valuation. As a consequence, Locke searches for a fixed point of reference upon which to base his relativistic philosophy. Not unlike Gertrude Stein's earlier attempt to relate or reduce consciousness to character types, Locke seeks to locate at the root of individual perception and evaluation elemental states of feelings common to mankind. Thus is the subjective universe of human meaning seen to have an underlying coherence and order. A comparison, even in incomplete suggestive outline, between a logical and psychological classification of values will show how much more neatly a schematization of values in terms of the mechanics of value feelings fits the facts than the rough approximations of the traditional logical classifications. More than this, such a classification not only states the basis on which the primary value groups generically rest, but reveals the process out of which they genetically arise. Thus Locke proceeds to elaborate modalities of feeling: exaltation, tension, acceptance or agreement, repose or equilibrium, psychological categories of value, which induce the moral attitude toward the situation irrespective of context. If, for example, one thinks a particular painting to be good or successful, the evaluation is essentially a subjective one rooted in the form feeling of repose or equilibrium. Although the particular merits of the painting might be defined in the course of discussion, the initial and all-important response is of a more elemental nature. Thus, our varied absolutes are revealed as largely the rationalization of our preferred values and their imperatives. Their taproot, it seems, stems more from the will to power than from the will to know. Locke's thought has taken a curious turn, for he appears to have challenged one form of absolutism only to replace it ultimately with another. Whereas he initially referred to generic types of value as feeling modes, he concludes by calling them psychological tribes, absolutes which simply must be acknowledged and allowed for. The confusion here results, I think, from a certain ambivalence Locke felt toward the very direction his thought had taken. And it is to this ambivalence that I wish to address my final remarks. But for the moment, it is important to note the context in which Locke framed his remarks. That is, it is Locke's basic contention that any theory of man has to acknowledge the role of feeling. And for the most part, his attention is given to developing the implications of this premise as it relates to the existential process of constructing reality. But beyond the mechanics of knowing per se, as it applies both to the individual within society and to those who offer intellectual perspectives, Locke cautions limits to the truths one fashions. Such ends totalize merely an aspect of human experience and stand only for a subsistent order of reality. They should not confuse themselves with that objective reality, nor attempt to deny or disparage its other value aspects and the subsistent orders they reflect. This totalizing character is purely functional in valuation, and it is a mockery of fact either to raise it to the level of transcendental worship or to endow it with objective universality. At the same time, Locke's emphasis on certain parameters or levels of knowing is linked to and mirrors a more general understanding that society itself constitutes diverse areas of meaning and experience. Cultural relativism, to my mind, is the culminating phase of relativistic philosophy. Thus, socially as well as philosophically, Locke argues for a world order essentially pluralistic in nature. One's absolutes are made to take their place within a context of other absolutes. For diversity and multiplicity qualify the most passionately held beliefs. One thing is certain, whatever change may have occurred in our thinking on the subject, we are still monists and absolutists, mainly in our practice of value, individual as well as social. But a theoretical break has come and seems to have set in simultaneously from several quarters. Panoramically viewed, the convergence of these trends indicates a new center for the thought and insight of our present generation, and that would seem to be a philosophy and a psychology, and perhaps too a sociology, pivoted around functionalistic relativism. Given Locke's emphasis on the individual and the existential reality of the individual, the grounds on which it was now possible to speak of a collective identity or experience is not altogether clear or convincing. However, what sustains this particular understanding is the implicit assumption that experience is bounded by a racial contour. In fact, race was experience, and when Locke wrote of culture, he wrote of a racial culture. Thus, as attitude and as vision, race served to unite Locke's dual concern, inner states of human consciousness and the external world of human experience. Locke's argument is, to a great extent, a distillation and synthesis of much that he had thought and written in previous years. As such, it serves to document in a concise, though abstract way, the essential elements and concerns of his thinking. It cannot, of course, stand for the whole of his thought. The specific interests and issues to which he gave voice are equally important for understanding both the dimensions of his thinking and the particular role he played in the Harlem Renaissance. However, Locke's philosophical concerns constitute a kind of inner voice which underlies and shapes his cultural and social interests. At the same time, Locke's philosophical considerations include a caution and an uncertainty that was also a part of his more public voice. H. Stuart Hughes's remarks concerning Max Weber offer a useful analogy with Locke's intellectual vision and his struggle to construct a meaningful philosophy. In his effort to transcend the positivist idealistic polemic, he, Weber, has striven for formulations that would keep together the sphere of logic and the sphere of value. In so doing, he alone invariably held to the central understanding of his whole generation. He alone never wavered in his insistence that both reason and illogic were essential to the comprehension of the human world. While reality, he implied, was dominated by unreason, it was only through rational treatment that it could be made comprehensible. Yet Weber's intellectual coherence had been acquired at the price of a psychic tension that was almost too much for the human mind to bear. Locke never fell victim to the acute psychic paralysis that overwhelmed Weber. Perhaps his life motto, all things with a reservation, reveals an aspect of his character that saved him from the extraordinary despair which Weber experienced. But throughout Locke's philosophical commentary, there exists a fear that he has opened the way to an anarchy of conflicting points of view, and this ambivalence, implicit in the very conception and design of his abstract thought, runs throughout his social commentary as well. In The New Negro, Locke announced the beginnings of a new era wherein black Americans now stood free of the crippling self-doubts of earlier generations. However, throughout this often buoyant, lyrical declaration of race consciousness and freedom, Locke warned against certain excesses that might occur. First, he cautioned his readers not to mistake this surge of intellectual and moral independence as anything less than a search for opportunities and responsibilities within the framework of traditional American values and institutions. The racialism of the Negro is no limitation or reservation with respect to American life. It is only a constructive effort to build the obstructions in the stream of his progress into an efficient dam of social energy and power. Democracy itself is obstructed and stagnated to the extent that any of its channels are closed. Indeed, they cannot be selectively closed. So the choice is not between one way for the Negro and another for the rest, but between American institutions, frustrated on the one hand, and American ideals progressively fulfilled and realized on the other. And second, Locke feared that if white Americans responded with hostility to this awakened sense of self-worth, the present optimism could degenerate into cynicism, counter-hatred, and reverse racism, a defiant superiority feeling. Clearly, the immediate responsibility for what took place, whether it be constructive or destructive, lay within the power and reason of white Americans. Whether it, race consciousness, actually brings into being new armadas of conflict or argosies of cultural exchange and enlightenment can only be decided by the attitude of the dominant races in an era of critical change. But at the same time, Locke also greatly feared that the black masses, once aroused by new yet false hopes, would lash out in their anger and frustration. Thus, Locke perceived the mid-1920s to be a critical moment wherein the dreams of a truly free and democratic society could just as easily become a nightmare of hatred and violence. Locke's commitment to the ideals and institutions of a democratic society was a deep personal conviction which informs much of his intellectual and social commentary. In his conception of the New Negro, for example, Locke distinguished what he understood to be kindred expressions of racial consciousness throughout the world from that which was taking place among black Americans. It seems to me what they, the Irish Renaissance, led by Yeats, Synge, Lady Gregory, etc., miss is the generic character of such social and cultural awakenings. A more scientific view of culture would give them a more democratic view at the same time. At the same time, Locke felt great ambivalence towards such a person as Marcus Garvey. He perceived in Garvey's racial exhortations the voice of the demagogue, the voice of conflict. However, the balance which Locke sought to achieve between racial consciousness and racial conflict cannot fully be understood within the framework of an oppressed minority seeking political and social redress. For Locke also struggled to come to terms with the very forces he himself so enthusiastically championed. In contrast to Garvey, who called for mass political action, Locke argued that meaningful change was possible only through the efforts of the intellectual and artistic elites of both races. For the present, more immediate hope rests in the revaluation by white and black alike of the Negro in terms of his artistic endowments and cultural contributions, past and prospective. The especially cultural recognition they win should in turn prove the key to that revaluation of the Negro, which must precede or accompany any considerable further betterment of race relationships. The faith in art and letters as a bridge across the chasm between the races gives the Harlem Renaissance its special and distinctive meaning. Throughout the 1920s, Locke eloquently argued his conviction that art signified accomplishment, and the artist symbolized and expressed the conscience of his race, perhaps even more, its consciousness. In The New Negro, Locke argued, "Hitherto it must be admitted that American Negroes have been a race more in name than in fact, or to be exact, more in sentiment than in experience. The chief bond between them has been that of a common condition rather than a common consciousness, a problem in common rather than a life in common." But now, through the alchemy of art, young black artists and writers were creating from the welter of experience a conscious expression of self, and welding this into a collective sense of black identity. In one sense, the artist was simply a voice giving expression to what existed in his and his people's collective past. What Locke had in mind was the existence of an inner spiritual core, a depth of feeling that was unique to blacks and which found its most genuine expression in the folk art and life of the people. And for this reason, throughout his various writings and criticism, Locke continually referred to the folk gift or folk spirit as a metaphor for that more pure time of feeling and inspiration when the innate creative genius of a people was directly transmitted into art forms of organic simplicity and elemental purity. Always, I hope, later art of the Negro will be true to original qualities of the folk temperament, though it may not perpetuate them in readily recognizable form. For the folk temperament raised to the levels of conscious art promises more originality and beauty than any assumed or imitated class of national or clique psychology available. The real future of Negro drama lies with the development of the folk play. Negro drama must grow in its own soil and cultivate its own intrinsic elements. Only in this way can it become truly organic and cease being a rootless derivative. For similar reasons, Locke gave considerable attention to African art and sought to awaken his contemporaries to the power and meaning of this neglected expression of aesthetic beauty and spiritual force. Locke's point was not simply that one should now appreciate the hitherto unappreciated, but that African art was an objective expression of man in fullest harmony with himself and his world. Thus, African art served as a model, a persuasive example, for others to find within themselves and their special experience a meaning and an identity. Rather than just a liberating idiom or an exotic fad, African art should act with all the force of a rediscovered folk art and give clues for the re-expression of a half-submerged race soul. For the most part, critics of Alain Locke have sought to define his achievement and understand his failings within the context of his immediate social and cultural setting. Such an approach has yielded a deeper understanding of Locke, the Harlem Renaissance, and what W.E.B. Du Bois referred to as the Americanness of Black Americans. But in these studies, the fact that Locke was also a student of philosophy has generally been ignored. Perhaps Locke himself contributed to this neglect, for, as he wrote, "All philosophies are in ultimate derivation products of time, place, and situation." Subsequent study has tended to follow the logic of his remark, and yet Locke, while a man of many interests, was of one mind. Although it is a mistake to suggest that all he wrote and thought can be reduced to a single point of view, it is no less a mistake to compartmentalize the several interests of his widely ranging intellect. Time, place, and situation are not simply an objective given, but a subjective construction. And Locke's hopes and his fears were as much the result of speculation as they were of experience.